This is the Italian Real Estate Podcast, here to help you with the ins and outs and basics of Italian real estate, presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Hello there, and welcome to another edition of the Italian Real Estate Podcast, presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Of course, we are back at it again with Italian attorney Marco Permunian. How are you doing today?
Good, how are you?
I am doing great, thank you. And in today's episode, we wanted to talk a little bit about renting in Italy, but more specifically about what are some of the responsibilities of the tenant and the owner in regards to the apartment in Italy. So Marco, let's maybe quickly just talk about some just different topics and categories, we could say, about who's responsible for what and what's responsible for who. But actually, even before we even get into that, can you maybe give us a little bit of a rundown of just kind of some of the basics that we may want to keep in mind with this episode?
If you are looking to rent a residential property in Italy, you should probably keep in mind that the process can be somewhat different to renting a residential property in other countries like the US, for example. First and foremost, the duration of the rental agreements for residential properties tend to be different from what you would find in other countries. Most of Italian landlords will offer rental agreements that are either 3 or 4 years long, and that's because they prefer to have people who stay in the apartment long term. Of course, things may change in a tourist destination, but generally speaking, across the country, if it's not a tourist destination, you will find landlords that prefer people, families, or individuals who take the apartment long term, meaning 3 years or 4 years. And there are standard contracts that are either 3 plus 2 years long or 4 plus 4 years long, which means that the contract will be automatically renewed for additional 2 or 4 years respectively if the parties decide not to cancel the agreement. Now, when you enter into a 3 or 4 years contract respectively, you of course have the ability to terminate the contract with a 6 months notice, whereas the landlord doesn't have the ability to evict you unless, of course, you do something wrong. Otherwise, they can only terminate the agreement at its expiration mark, meaning the 3 years or 4 years mark, respectively. Something else that you might want to keep in mind when looking at apartments for rent in Italy is that most landlords will be very selective when it comes to their tenants. So it is not sufficient to say, hey, it's me, I'm looking for an apartment in Italy, just, let's enter into a contract. You can expect to have an interview process with the landlord, during which the landlord will try to understand who you are, if you have the ability to pay the rent. So they want to see your financials, like your job contract or your income statements, to understand who you are, who exactly will occupy the apartment. So if you are a single individual, if you have a family of 2 or 3, and if you have the necessary means to not only support yourself and your family, but of course to pay the rent every month. And of course, since we are on the topic, one thing to keep in mind when renting in Italy is that the landlord will be responsible for major concerns, so extraordinary maintenance, whereas the tenant is generally responsible for ordinary maintenance, meaning minor concerns.
And so when we're talking about this, like, say, for example, if you rent a furnished apartment, what about the furniture itself? Like if something happens along those lines with just kind of the daily wear and tear, whose responsibility would that be?
First of all, let me say that in Italy, it's very common to find furnished apartments, especially talking about apartments and not houses, but it's more unlikely to find a house for rent. It's more likely to find houses like detached houses or semi-detached houses for rent. It's more likely to find those kind of properties for sale, and it's more likely to find apartments, whether it's a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom, even if it's not so likely to find 3-bedroom apartments, but of course they exist. So when it comes to apartments, it is much more likely to find them already furnished. It's less likely to find apartments for rent that are not furnished. At the very least, the kitchen will, generally speaking, be there, so it will be offered by the landlord. But while it's possible to find apartments that have only the kitchen, it's much more common to find apartments that are fully furnished. By fully furnished, I mean apartments that have a kitchen, a table in the kitchen, and the chairs, sofa, beds. By kitchen, I mean that all the fixtures and sink and everything is there. So that's what normally happens in Italy. Also, you can expect to have a washing machine, sometimes a dryer, but this is normally the essential. So what you will find in the most common scenarios in an apartment for rent in Italy. Now, when it comes to the normal wear and tear, it is not your responsibility. It is the responsibility of the owner. So if you damage the couch by using it every day, that is not something that you need to repair when you move out from the apartment. But if there is something that goes beyond the normal wear and tear, so if you accidentally with a knife damage the couch, maybe you were opening a package on the couch, then it's your responsibility to repair the couch or replace the couch. So when it comes to furniture, whatever goes beyond the normal wear and tear is your responsibility, and it's not the responsibility of the owner. And of course, you should bring up to the owner the fact that you damaged something extensively when that happens. Otherwise, you may risk that the owner subtracts that amount from the deposit when they realize that there was a damage made to the furniture. Maybe when you do the final walkthrough, when the time comes to leave the apartment, maybe the owner will realize, or maybe they will realize after you have left. And of course, in that situation, it will need to be proven whose fault it was, if it was you or if it's something that happened afterwards. But the bottom line is, this is something that you are responsible for if it's a damage that goes beyond the normal wear and tear. Otherwise, it's a responsibility of the owner to replace or restore whatever item was damaged due to the normal usage of the furniture.
Very interesting. And so, also just kind of moving on from here, regarding, say, like some of the major and minor repairs that might come up in an apartment, like, say, for example, like the water boiler. This is one thing that I know for me was actually a little bit of a surprise when I first learned about how this is handled in Italy. Is this considered to be a major thing or a minor thing? Like, if you have a water heater in your building, who would be the person that would be actually responsible for the maintenance of that unit?
With regard to the boiler, the installation, of course, is something that the landlord is responsible for, and the same goes for major repair works. But when it comes to ordinary maintenance, and especially the cleaning, the annual cleaning of the boiler, which is something that you have to do by law in Italy, whether you're the owner or the tenant, but you have to do it if you're occupying an apartment. And in the case of the landlord and tenant relationship, it's the responsibility of the tenant to clean the boiler annually, which of course is something that needs to be done through a company, generally speaking, that does that for work. So you need to call somebody that comes every year to clean the boiler. On the other hand, if it just breaks down, it is not the responsibility of the tenant to replace it. It is the responsibility of the owner of the apartment.
And so, what about things that are maybe more used by the full building? Say, if you're in an apartment building and there would be like an elevator or common areas that have to be cleaned, how are those sorts of things handled?
The cleaning of the common areas must be paid by the person who is using the apartment, so the tenant. So while the condominium manager will probably send the bill to the landlord will charge the tenant regarding the expenses that have to do with the cleaning of the common areas. With regard to the elevator, the expenses related to the normal use of the elevator, so electricity, for example, are to be paid by the tenant. So, because it's, of course, the tenant who is using the elevator to go up and down to reach the apartment. But when it comes to major expenses like major repair works or replacement or installation, then it's the responsibility of the owner to take care of those.
And so when you're talking about like the kind of general kind of usage of the elevator and so on, or the common areas, are these things that are covered under the condominium fees, or are these things that would come on top of the condominium fees?
The ordinary maintenance fees and extraordinary maintenance fees related maybe to something that broke or something major that needed to be repaired will be included in the common charges. Of course, if there were major repair works to be done, maybe the elevator needed to be replaced, or something major happened, and the condominium manager approved these repair works, you can expect to have higher common charges in that specific month that will be charged to you. Of course, only a portion of these common charges the tenant is responsible for, because there is also a portion that the owner will be responsible for. And more specifically, all of the charges that are considered to be extraordinary maintenance. So for example, if the elevator broke, it's the owner that is responsible for paying the portion of the common charges that have to do with the replacement of the elevator.
Well, thank you, Marco. And while we're on the topic of these kind of common areas, these communal areas within the building, what if, for example, say you're walking in your hall and one of the light bulbs, for whatever reason, may not be fully functional, it might have blown, something might have gone out. Who would it be that you would have to be in contact with about this? Are you, as the person to see this light bulb, the person who's responsible to replace it, or is the building management the ones that are responsible, or is your landlord responsible? How do these all kind of work in the situation?
So in the case of a light bulb specifically, the replacement, it's on you. So neither the condominium manager nor the landlord is responsible for doing so. However, if there is a malfunctioning of the entire system that caused, the bulb exploding, for example, because the electrical system had a major problem, then you will need to call your landlord to have it checked, and it will be done at their expenses. The condominium manager is generally not involved in these things unless what caused the problem was the electrical system of the condominium itself. So not something that has to do with the unit that was rented to you. Rather, maybe the condominium electrical system caused a problem to the electrical system of the unit itself, in which case you will need to go through the owner to have the condominium manager replace or repair uh, uh, whatever caused the issue. Now, on the other hand, if it's a light bulb that is outside of your unit, so in the common hallway, then if there is the need to replace one or multiple bulbs, you as the tenant should contact the condominium manager to ask them to replace those bulbs.
Very interesting. And then also, another kind of last little question here. Say, for example, maybe the wall needs to be painted, or it was damaged, or maybe because of mold, that there was some sort of need for the apartment to be repainted. Who would be responsible for what and in which situation?
There's a lot to discuss regarding repainting the walls in an apartment. So it used to be that in every single contract you will find that the tenant was responsible for repainting the walls when they were moving out of the apartment, and at the same time the landlord was guaranteeing that the walls were being freshly repainted before the tenant moved into the apartment. So you would expect your apartment to come with the walls or painted, and you were expected to repaint the walls either at your expenses, or you could do it yourself as long as you did it professionally uh, uh, when you were moving out of the apartment. Now, the Italian Supreme Court has declared that that provision cannot be basically validly entered in a contract, or rather, the landlord cannot force you to accept some provision, because it was highly unfair for the tenant, who was expected basically to repaint the whole apartment even if no damage was done to any of the walls. Now the tenant is only expected after this ruling to have to repaint the walls that they damaged. So if there was a damage done to a specific wall, then you have to repaint it. Otherwise, it's not necessary. Now, regarding mold, that is a different story, because if there is mold on the wall, it needs to be understood whether it's something that has to do with maybe how the apartment is made, or if it's something that was caused by the tenant. Maybe it's a combination of the two factors. In this case, it's normally not easy to understand who is the person that caused the problem. Of course, the landlord tends to state that maybe the windows were closed and maybe the clothes were being hanged in the apartment. At the same time, maybe there was no other space where to hang the clothes, and so some humidity was caused inside the apartment, or maybe the walls were not painted properly, which means that a small amount of humidity caused mold. So it needs to be normally properly assessed who is the person that caused the problem, and depending on that, we can understand who is responsible for remedying to that problem.
Well, very interesting. And Marco, thank you so much for making yourself available. And of course, if anybody is looking to move to Italy, to purchase property in Italy, or to rent a property in Italy, how can they get in contact with you and your team?
People can contact us through our website, italianrealestatelawyers.com, or give us a call. Our number is on the website.
Well, absolutely fantastic. And of course, if you're interested in more about purchasing property in Italy, renting property in Italy, and maybe even where to do so, be sure that you're subscribed to the YouTube channel as well as the audio-only podcast. But of course, if you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, that means you're also subscribed automatically to the Italian Citizenship Podcast, another project where Marco and I collaborate on, where we discuss about legally making Italy your home, as well as now Ask the Italian Lawyer, bite-sized episodes where we ask Marco about various topics that have to do with Italian law. Of course, also, if you're interested in more about life abroad and living abroad, be sure to come over to my YouTube channel and audio podcast. You can search for Not Your Average Globetrotter or my name, Rafael Di Furia, on YouTube or your favorite podcasting app. But of course, again, we have been here with Italian attorney Marco Permunian from ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Stay safe and healthy out there, and we will see you all next time for the next episode of the Italian Real Estate Podcast. Later.
Thank you.